Okay, so the topic of this video is ecology and the ecological levels of organization. So let's go ahead and get started. Well, let's go ahead and start by just defining what is ecology, and it's the study of how life interacts within one's environment. Here's a picture of a food web, and this food web shows how life interacts by transferring nutrients from one organism to another as organisms feed upon each other. And so this is a great example of what we've learned by studying ecology, is how energy moves throughout the ecosystem, for instance. And so the whole point of ecology is really to show the impact that life has on the environment and vice versa. This picture here shows that over the past few decades, the amount of coal, natural gas, and liquid fuels, oils have increased, and therefore we've given off more and more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and this has an impact on the quality of life. Well, what I'd like you to do really quick is think about, how do you positively interact within the environment? Maybe you're into rock climbing, maybe you're more into surfing, maybe you enjoy going on nature hikes, maybe horseback riding, maybe fishing, but there are ways in which we all interact positively within the environment. I'm asking you if you can take a moment to kind of contemplate and reflect on ways that you interact within your environment. Well, let's actually get into the ecological levels of organization here, starting with a population, a group of the same species living in the area. And before we go on and talk more about populations, let's just have a little bit of fun. Here we have a group of fish here. What's the word that we would call a group of fish? Well, that would be a school. Well, how about this one? A blank of sheep. What word is missing? This would be a herd. Don't worry, they get harder. Okay, how about this one? Blank of kittens. Well, that would be a litter. How about this one? Blank of geese. They're going to start to get a little more challenging. This would be a gaggle of geese. How about this one? A blank of lions. That would be a pride. A blank of monkeys. That would be a troop. A blank of whales. Well, that would be a pod. A blank of jellyfish. Well, that would be a smack of jellyfish. And kind of my favorite one, blank of crows. That would be a murder of crows. Now, no, if you're in my biology class, I'm not going to test you on all of those. That was just having a little fun and being a little silly. Let's get back, though, to populations and kind of studying it and the patterns that we've learned. So here's a group of rabbits here. Now, eventually, these rabbits are going to multiply. They're going to reproduce, make offspring, and throughout the generations, their numbers will probably accumulate. Now, there are what we call limiting factors within the environment that keep the population of rabbits under control. Probably one of the most obvious limiting factors would be predation, the fact that predators help to control the population of prey simply by catching and eating them. So if there's wolves lurking around, they would probably catch and keep the rabbit population under control. Another example would be competition for food, competition for territory, a lack of resources. Water could be is a very important resource, and if there's not enough of it in this particular environment, then that would control the populations. As would disease. As more individuals are born, the chance of spreading disease is greater. So these are called limiting factors. And when we start to graph a population, we notice that populations tend to go through stages. So here's a graph of a typical population growth pattern. And we can actually break it down into 3 stages. What we notice first is a slow growth period. The population is growing slowly as it's adapting to its particular environment. So over time, if I plot these points here, yeah, you can see the plot points are going up a little bit, but it's a very slow growth. And then you start thinking, well, why is that? Well, at this time, birth rates are probably pretty low. The life that is growing here, they're struggling to survive. Natural selection is slowly eliminating those that are not fit to survive in this environment, and those that are fit to survive will eventually start to reproduce and make lots of offspring. And that kind of leads us into stage 2. Well, stage 2 is a period of what is called exponential growth. Notice how the plot points suddenly, dramatically, sharply increase. High birth rates due to natural selection and resources. At this point, the weaker individuals within the population, within the herd perhaps, have been eliminated by perhaps predators. And so you have the very best adapted males and the very best adapted females breeding and reproducing with one another to make very well adapted offspring. And so at this time we experience a population surge called exponential growth. And that leads us to stage 3, when the population tends to hit a plateau. It starts to level off at a period known as its carrying capacity. This is the greatest number of individuals that the environment can sustain. There's just maybe not enough food for many more individuals within this particular environment. And so if we kind of connect the dots here, you can see this nice little, what is called an S-shaped growth pattern. Use your imagination. You can kind of see the letter S in that curve right there of the line. And this is fairly typical across populations. You know, when I look at this graph right here, which shows the total human population throughout time, ask yourself, what stage of population growth are humans within? Well, you can see we're in the exponential growth stage. The line is curving upward at a very high rate. And so you think about, why is that? Why are we in exponential growth? Well, today we're pretty good at fighting disease. We're mass producing more and more food. We're building shelters in environments that used to be inhospitable. We're irrigating in the middle of deserts, and so we're bringing water to environments that don't typically have water. And so by doing all this, we're able to produce more and more resources to support more and more humans. And so what happens once carrying capacity is reached? Well, let me extend my graph a little bit. Well, there's 2 patterns that we tend to see next. Number 1, the population tends to stabilize, and that's what we hope will eventually happen to humans. Eventually, we would predict the human population to reach a carrying capacity. We hope it will stabilize. Now, the other possibility is this. Well, the other possibility is this here. If I plot the data points, what is called a population crash. So which of these is eventually in store for humans? Will humans stabilize after reaching carrying capacity, or will the human population experience a crash? Well, we just don't know. Hopefully we can take the lessons from ecology and other areas of society and other areas of culture to prevent this population crash. Well, let's flip the page here and talk about what are called communities. A community are many populations living in the same area. Here we have our rabbits, and let's also include, plant life, grasses and trees, and maybe even some fungus mushrooms growing here. And some birds have maybe migrated into this area, and lurking in the background are wolves that keep the rabbit population under control. This would be an example of a community. Well, throughout nature, there's all kinds of communities. Here's a desert community. Aside from the vegetation you see, I'm sure there's insects scurrying around, and reptiles, and, perhaps even small mammals make up part of the desert community. Here's a coral reef community. You have the corals themselves, which are alive, plus maybe invertebrates like, shrimp and crabs, and don't forget about the vertebrate fish that are swimming around, all make up the coral reef community. And even in a wetland community here, you have, of course, the plant life that you see in the picture, but also the fish that are swimming around, birds that migrate in, insects. These are all part of the wetland community. And so the patterns from studying communities, well, each organism has its own habitat. A habitat is simply the place where an organism lives. Here we see, there's a den here, which is used as a habitat, a place to live. Here's an example of a bird building a nest as part of its habitat. Here's a wasp nest, if I remember correctly, and again, part of the habitat where these wasps would then live. and even in the aquatic organisms as well. Here we have some clownfish burrowing amongst the tentacles of an anemone. And also another pattern is that every species tends to have its own niche. Well, you know, if you're watching this video, you're probably a high school student, and I hope that you find your niche within your school. Maybe your niche is maybe a part of the performing arts. Maybe your niche is maybe more towards athletics. Maybe your niche is just with a group of like-minded classmates and friends that you've accumulated over the years. I hope you see what a niche is. It's kind of where you fit into your school. And if we apply this word niche to biology, it's the role of a species, the needs of a species. For instance, rabbits would be a good example. Part of their niche would be that they're herbivores. They help control the plant population. And then the predators, the wolves, are predators and carnivores. They help to control the population of, let's say, the rabbits. Well, the mushrooms are decomposers. They break down dead plant material, dead animal material, and return nutrients to the soil so the plants can then grow even better. And so these are examples of the niche that the organisms have in their community. We look at those birds. You know, not only are the birds maybe omnivores, because maybe they eat insects and also berries, but part of their niche is also perhaps the blue ones will build their nest and lay their eggs in the autumn, and they eat insect A. And living in the exact same trees might be these other birds, and you would think they'd compete with one another. Wouldn't the bluebirds chase away the the bluebirds chase away the pink birds, or maybe the pink birds would chase away the bluebirds? Well, what prevents that is they each have their own niche. Maybe the pink birds build their nest in the springtime and they eat a different kind of insects. So even though they're living in the same habitat, they're living in the same trees, their niche, they have a separate niche where they don't overlap, and therefore they're able to coexist. Let's flip the page to the next higher level called an ecosystem. And this is not just the living, but also the non-living parts of an environment. Here we have everything that we've seen before, but let me add some rocks, and let me add a pond, and let me add some moisture in the sky in the form of clouds, and let's add the sun shining on a nice sunny day. This would now be more symbolic here of an ecosystem. An ecosystem is made of the living parts, or the biotic factors within the environment, the animals, the plants, the fungus, the bacteria, the protista. In my collage, everything that's blinking right now is part of the living, part of the biotic conditions of this particular ecosystem. Well, then there's also the non-living factors, or the abiotic aspects of an ecosystem. These are the rocks, the climate, the soil, the water, factors that can influence life but are not alive themselves. In my collage, you can see the water is blinking, the clouds, the sun, the rocks, the soil. These are all part of the non-living components within an ecosystem. And so the patterns from studying ecosystems, well, this sounds very scientific. It's actually pretty straightforward, though. Biotic is affected by the abiotic. Again, it sounds really fancy, but all we're saying is that life can be affected by non-living factors. For instance, here we have a picture of a drought in a dry area, and it says the success of plants and animals is greatly impacted by drought. Non-living factors such as a lack of water can greatly impact things that are alive. Another example would be what we see in this picture right here. The aquatic organisms that live in this waterway, the fish, for instance, maybe some amphibians, they would be harmed by any of the chemicals that are in the pollution given off by this factory here. And so chemicals and pollution, those are abiotic non-living factors, but they can have a big impact on the quality of life. And here we have an example of what's called coral bleaching. If you're familiar with this, this is really sad. The destruction of coral reefs. Coral reefs are living organisms, but their health is incredibly threatened because of rising ocean temperatures. And temperature in water, this is abiotic. Water is not alive. Temperature is not a living factor. but these are non-living factors that can greatly influence the health of things that are alive. And the other pattern is really just vice versa. This sounds very complicated here. Abiotic is affected by the biotic, but what it really says is that things that are not alive can be impacted by things that are alive. For instance, the nutrient quality of soil is greatly aided by the actions of, for instance, fungus. Fungus are living organisms, but they return nutrients into the soil. And soil is a non-living abiotic component of an ecosystem. And another example would be climate change. Earth's climate is a non-living factor, but it's being altered by the actions of humans when we are very much part of the biotic world. Well, throughout ecology, we've identified what are called keystone species, and these are ones that have an unusually large impact within their ecosystem. You know, humans are an obvious example. But let's look at a couple less obvious examples. For instance, beavers are a good example of a keystone species. They have an unusually large impact on their ecosystem. By them creating beaver dams, they will slow the flow of this little stream here, and that creates pools of water which are habitats for greater numbers of fish. Of course, the increased fish might attract birds to the area to build their nest and live out their lives, to hunt the fish. And then the still water created because of the beaver dam is a breeding ground for insects. So by removing the beavers in the beaver dam, this entire ecosystem might not even exist. And that's what we mean by a keystone species. They have a great impact on their ecosystem. Another example of a keystone species would be sea otters. They're adorably cute, but they're also really wonderful in maintaining the quality of kelp forests. And so sea otters help to control the population of sea urchins that scurry along the bottom of the ocean. And sea urchins can be devastating to kelp forests because the urchins will eat away at the base of the kelp, break the stalk of kelp, and it kind of floats away with the current of the ocean. And so to prevent that and to help maintain the health of the kelp forest, you know, the sea otters will eat the urchins. Now the problem we're seeing though is of course that sea otters are threatened due to overhunting and due to habitat loss. And so these very healthy kelp forests are actually becoming threatened because the urchins are overpopulating and destroying these beautiful kelp forests. So, but that's an example of a keystone species, how the actions of one species, the actions of the sea otters, can have a huge impact on their ecosystem. Okay, let's flip and go to a biome, a large area with a very distinct climate, plant life, and animal life. So let's zoom out. Here's my collage of an ecosystem from a moment ago. Let's zoom out. And when we zoom out even further, we come to an example of a biome here. Notice what I mean by a large area of land. It covers, in this case, northern United States and Canada. And so this is an example of the taiga biome. This biome is characteristic of having moderately warm summers, long, cold, dry winters. Another example would be deserts, the desert biome. You can see some desert locations from this map. And desert characteristics, general characteristics here, they tend to be warm throughout the year, very hot in the summer, and dry. Another example of a biome would be the tundra. The tundra characterized by extremely low temperatures, little precipitation, poor nutrients, and very short growing seasons. Another example of a biome would be the rainforest, tropical rainforest, typically along the equator of the Earth. These are warm year-round, these biomes have warm year-round temperatures with a lot of rainfall and the greatest diversity of species anywhere on Earth. Another example of a biome would be deciduous forests, and these are characterized by having well-defined seasons. Their trees tend to lose their leaves in the autumn, and as a result, the soil is very rich in nutrients because all those decaying leaves add to the nutrient richness of the soil. Well, how about the grasslands? The grasslands you can see here in this map area, and These are lands, like the name implies, dominated by grasses. You tend to have hot summers and cold winters. Rainfall tends to be moderate. Not enough rain to get big trees, but tall grasses and such. And so the pattern is that the climate of a biome really determines what life can survive. Here's kind of a map of the biomes of the world. There's a reason we find cacti in, let's say, Southwest desert United States here, is because the climate of this particular biome supports their growth. There's a reason we see polar bears in, northern Canada and this area of the world, because they are adapted to the climate of this particular biome. And here in northern Australia, for instance, saltwater crocodiles provides the perfect environment. The climate is suitable for their survival. And maybe along the equator, like perhaps in Costa Rica, is where we find, sloths right here. Again, the climate of this biome supports their ability to survive. These four organisms would probably do very poorly if they were to be transported to other biomes around the world to survive and fend for themselves. Okay, let's flip the page and talk about the final ecological level, the biosphere. And this is really the area of the Earth where life can be found. When I look at this picture here of the Earth, is the core of the Earth a part of the biosphere? And the answer is no, not at all. Is the mantle a part of the biosphere? No, there's no life as far as we can tell in the mantle and in the core. How about the entire crust? Is the entire crust a part of the biosphere? No. So again, it's not the Earth, the entire Earth, that's a part of the biosphere. It's the portion of the Earth where we can find life. And I think this picture really shows nicely where the biosphere is. Well, at its highest point, about 12 kilometers above sea level, is this particular vulture right here, which has been identified as being the world's highest flying animal, highest flying bird. And at the lowest point, about 11 kilometers below sea level, are these little microscopic organisms called foraminifera. And if you Google the phrase benthic foraminifera, you can read more about these. And so everything in between that vulture on top and the microscopic foraminifera at the bottom of the picture, that's the biosphere. Now, the vulture represents the extreme upper part of the biosphere, and the foraminifera represent the extreme lower part of the biosphere. But most life is found within this red region here, about 6,000 meters above sea level and about 500 meters below sea level. That's where we find most life within the biosphere. And so the pattern is that the biosphere changes, any changes to the biosphere can have a tremendous impact on life. You probably know our atmosphere has some carbon dioxide in it, and energy from the sun will radiate across space, and the carbon dioxide, as well as other greenhouse gases like methane. Carbon dioxide and these greenhouse gases tend to absorb some of the heat and keep our planet nice and warm. We call this the greenhouse effect, and the greenhouse effect is viewed as a very good quality, helps to naturally warm our planet. But what we've seen is over the past few decades is the input and the release of a lot more carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And as a result, this tends to trap more and overly warm the planet, and this is what is known as climate change here. So one of the patterns is that greatly impacting, by altering the biosphere, can have a great impact on life. Well, as I wrap up this video, I want to mention 3 scientists that were very inspirational throughout my childhood. 1 being Carl Sagan, 2 being Jacques Cousteau, and the 3rd being Jane Goodall. When I was a child growing up, these 3 were regularly airing, documentaries on PBS, and I was just fascinated by them. And it led to me wanting to study more and more science as I got older. And each of them has left an impact throughout ecology. Each of them has helped us to understand the impact that we have in our environment and in our world. And it's one of the reasons why I think this fits as part of this presentation. And if I can finish with this, the Voyager 1 space probe, if you're familiar with this, in 1977, NASA launched Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 probes to explore the solar system. And in 1990, this picture right here was taken by Voyager 1, and this picture has been titled The Pale Blue Dot, past Neptune, at a distance of about 6 billion kilometers from Earth. Voyager 1 took a photograph of Earth. You can see that little tiny blue pixel right there. That's the planet Earth at an incredibly far distance. And in his book, Carl Sagan wrote a then book titled Pale Blue Dot. And I'm not going to read this for you. If you're interested, pause the video and please read yourself. But I found these words just to be inspirational and just to reflect upon the impact that I have and my relationship with the environment that I grew up within. And so there you have it. If you're in my biology class, go ahead and pause the video and try to answer these questions. I'm happy to check your answers before or after school one day. And if you have any comments, post them below. I'd like to see what you think. Thanks for watching.